Thank you very much, Suzanne. Firstly, can I say thank you very much for the invite, and to GMCVO, who I've known for a long time and do great work. I also want to say it's a funny day for me to be doing this, because technically some of you may be aware that the University and College Union is on strike at the minute. And so I did have a slight reservation about doing this, about the concept of the digital picket line, but because I thought it was for charity practitioners rather than university work, so I thought I'll make that deal with myself. But if you do want to know more about the UCU strike and why we're taking action, I've put a link with more information about that in the chat box, if you'd like to look more at that. Can you see those slides? Can I have a nod? Yeah, excellent, great. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today is an overview of certain findings from my book, The Good Glow, Charity and the Symbolic Power of Doing Good. What I want to focus on specifically is a bit of sociology theory to explain what I mean by the symbolic power of charity, and hopefully that's an idea that a lot of you will recognize, even if you haven't used that language to describe it before. And then talk about how, in my view, the charity sector and charities and people who are charitable use that symbolic power and the distinction of being from a charitable organization in the policy sphere a little bit, and the various ways in which charity and the policy sphere have been in conflict in recent years in the UK. And then finally, I want to apply some of these ideas to the case study of the collapse of Kids Company that some of you may remember went under in 2015 for various reasons, and unpick that. But hopefully this will touch on various different aspects and raise some interesting questions along the way. But I want to start with an example involving the 45th president of the USA, Donald Trump. So this is a picture from 1996, and it's at the launch of a charity in New York called the Association to Benefit Children, the ABC. And this was a charity event launching a new set of children's orphanages for children in New York, at which you can see at the back here, you can see Rudy Giuliani, the then mayor of New York, who later went on to be Trump's lawyer, and in fact Donald Trump here participating in a little dance. I think it was This Little Light of Mine that the children were singing and dancing along to. But Trump hadn't given a penny to this organization. And this is how the Washington Post journalist David Farenthold tells the story about how Trump usurped the actual donor to the charity, Stephen Fisher. Nobody knew he was coming, said one person. Then there is this ruckus at the door and in comes Donald Trump. He just gets up on the podium and sits down. Trump was not a major donor. He was not a donor at all. He'd never given $1 to the nursery or the ABC. And now he was sitting in the actual donor's seat next to Mayor Giuliani. What should we do? One person said, oh, just sing past it. So they warbled into the first song on the program alongside Trump and a chorus of children, and Trump looking for all the world like an honored donor to the cause. Afterwards, two charity workers said he left without offering an explanation or a donation. The actual donor who had built the nursery, Stephen Fisher, was stuck in the audience. The charity spent months trying to repair their relationship with him. And if you know anything about Donald Trump's charity, that's not unfamiliar. That's actually quite how he practiced charitable giving. Trump was famous for promising to give people money, for promising to use his foundation to invest in things, and then not delivering in reality. Although he did bank the good headlines and the good pictures and the good press that came with it. And for me, Trump is an interesting example of what we might call the symbolic power of charity. He is aware that charity makes you look good. He is aware that being charitable, being kind, being generous, giving your money away is wrapped up with a certain amount of goodness. It puts a halo on your head, it puts a good glow around you. People might respect you more because you have given your money away. It's what the critic Anand Giridharadas calls reputation laundering in various ways. It can be used as a way of taking someone, you know, oh, he's Donald Trump, he's pretty rough around the edges, he's a multi-billionaire property developer, but he's got a kind heart. Look at him, obviously giving money to that nursery program and that children's charity. And it's an interesting example, I think, of sort of how people can take to the nth degree the fact that being charitable does do you some benefit, as alongside doing the world some benefit. And the theorist Pierre Bourdieu, who was probably France's premier sociologist in the 20th century, talked about this in terms of the importance of the symbolic. So to boil this down, there are two ways in which reality works. There are two planes in which it operates: the material and the symbolic. The material is made up of this pen and this book and this computer and this webcam and all the stuff. And then the symbolic is to do with the value of those things. And those two values don't always match up. This pen might be worth 2p on the open market on eBay, but it might have immense personal treasured wealth to me. It might have been passed on to me in some way. In the charity world, you think of it in a different way. You know, the value of a volunteer in a hospital going bed to bed to bed, visiting people, talking to them, putting them at ease, offering them a shoulder to cry on or someone to be kind to them for 5 minutes, might only be worth on the open market £10 an hour, the minimum wage. But really, that we know from all our work with volunteers that often the fact that that person is giving their time makes that time worth much more than the hourly rate that they may achieve. There's far more importance behind the fact that someone is doing something off their own back, of their own free will, charitably, if you will. It's to do with, you know, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. Because Bourdieu argued that within society, we all pay homage to those who are apparent objects of respect and to the social order that makes that person respectable. It's a social fact that we should want people to be more charitable. We should be happy that when people are charitable, and we should be, you know, have a higher opinion of. We should pay more respect to people who are charitable, to people who are kind. We wouldn't want to live in a society in which the opposite was untrue. But people have the possibility of seeing that reality and taking advantage of it. And Bourdieu thought that all of symbolic life became something of a game. We're all trying to win everything all the time: belief, credit and discredit, perception, appreciation, knowledge, recognition, name, renown, prestige, honor, glory. Everything becomes part of a game that in our work we are all trying to win at it, all of the time. We're all trying to show ourselves as good people to our friends, to our family, to our colleagues, to society at large, maybe showing off about our good deeds on social media. And so therefore that means that people are constantly calculating. And for a long time, charity sort of didn't exist within this calculation. I'm going to go through examples in a minute of how it fits in. Gifts would be an interesting example. People give gifts. It's been long argued in anthropology and sociology, partly to show how powerful they are over other people. I give you a gift to show that I can afford a gift, that I sort of want to form a gift relationship with you, that maybe you are in my debt. If you might give someone a present, they might feel quite embarrassed. You sort of almost punish them by giving them a gift, because you then they then think that they owe you in some way. So gifts can be used as an egoistic calculation, and nobody's really unaware that this is true in some places. Think about all those times that you've given Christmas presents to people for no apparent reason. You've almost exchanged a bottle of wine or a bunch of flowers just because you have to give a gift, because if you don't, you look selfish or uncaring. This sort of symbolic argument features in lots of different ways in everyday charity, such as gift giving, but also in mega philanthropy. If you look at the debates over the giving of Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, for example, lots of times you can find that they were partly looking for a form of reputation laundering. Bill Gates set up his foundation in the wake of his antitrust lawsuit. And he said, I would give all my money away to get rid of this stain on my reputation. And so that idea that we can use our money as a gift in order to make ourselves look good is quite well received and discussed at that higher end. There's a recent example of a senator in the US who'd basically done insider trading, had got some insider information on the coronavirus pandemic, and had invested in Zoom and face masks before, but in public was telling her constituents that there was nothing to worry about and it was all democratic fear-mongering. She then sold herself, her re-election campaign, on the fact that she'd lent her private plane to her constituents to help them get back to Georgia from wherever they were trapped by the coronavirus pandemic, using her wealth and her charity as a way to help people forget that she'd actually acted quite corruptly. I mentioned social media earlier. There's a chapter in the book about this concept of the humble brag, the boast disguised as the moan, as they talk about it in the Urban Dictionary online. When we might sort of, oh, I'm so tired from working at that homelessness hostel all night. And I spoke to about 30 young people who talked about the ways in which charity fed into their online lives. I mean, young people are incredibly, I think the word is, trapped by social media a lot of the time, always thinking and rethinking how they look online, how they act, how they respond to their friends. You know, getting into fights because you didn't like somebody's status update early enough. I spoke to one young man who talked about a fight that he'd seen at his school between two young women because one hadn't shared her the other's fundraising campaign on Facebook quickly enough. She was fundraising to raise money because her nan had died of cancer, and she was raising money for a cancer charity. And this friend hadn't liked it or shared it or done it quickly enough. And she said, why do you not care about me? Why do you not care about my nan? Why do you not care about cancer? And it felt like charity was starting to become this thing that they were forced to compete over or forced to present themselves in certain ways. It's what Foucault would call a technology of the self, or a discussion of presenting yourself as the good giving self. I've written quite a lot about how young people are forced to volunteer in many ways. There's a sort of carrot and the stick approach. The carrot is, oh, well, this will help you get a good job. And the stick is, if you don't do it, a young person with volunteering on their CV will get this job in the future. There's a line from Beckers and Bauman, which is, you can believe I'm a good person because I volunteer. Volunteering on a CV is a great sort of shortcut to showing that that person is a moral, upstanding citizen, because bad people don't volunteer. Yeah, of course they do. Or of course, you know, people are complicated and have all manner of motivations. Volunteering isn't a shortcut to showing you're good, but because employers would, 85% of employers would prefer someone who had volunteering on their CV to someone who didn't, we end up in a situation where volunteering is used as a tool of competition. Or gap years, you know, who's had the most successful thing on their gap year? How do we use volunteering as a tool of showing someone to be good? Frank Bruni in the New York Times wrote an article about college admissions in the United States. He found an example of a wealthy couple who had bought an orphanage in Botswana so that their children could go and volunteer at this orphanage for 3 to 6 months, so that they had something to write about on their personal statements. You know, seeing charity as a tool to demonstrate your goodness, to get on in your university, academic, or employment life is sort of the most intense articulation of this whole problem, I suppose. But sort of just students being able to use their gap years, which, let's be honest, for most of them are things about experience and about leisure and about travel and about seeing the world and opening new horizons, but at the same time end up having a lot of the time a charitable element. Speak to a lot of my students who say, yeah, we went to this village and we painted this mural and then all the kids loved it. And at the end of the weekend, someone came along and whitewashed the mural off because the next group of white Westerners were going to come in and paint it again next week. And so you end up, what is charity actually doing in these places? And the other one, which is a more controversial one, and we've just been through Remembrance season, is discussions about the Remembrance Poppy, and what's become known as poppy fascism in popular debates. And again, there's a chapter on this in the book. the poppy, I argue, has become a weaponized symbol of remembrance and fundraising. It's raised, I think, £3.5 billion over the years for the Royal British Legion and veterans. But at the same time, it's a charitable symbol that is weaponized and used to attack people who don't wear it, and people are questioned as un-British or unpatriotic if it falls off. You know, the Cookie Monster, when he appeared on the One Show, had a poppy stuck to him because if he didn't, they were worried that people might complain that the Cookie Monster was insufficiently praising of veterans communities. And so you end up in a situation where, again, a charitable symbol becomes wrapped up with notions of goodness or badness, and it can become weaponized or used malevolently by certain individuals. This was a photo I took in the Cancer Research UK shop on Ecclesall Road in Sheffield. I shop at Cancer Research UK. I save lives. I would say this is a sort of marketing tool that aims to showcase the symbolic credit that the shopper gets from showing other people, look at me, I've donated to cancer research. If you don't shop at Cancer Research, are you killing people? Is that the bit below the bag? Is that the next sentence? So it's sort of using charity as a way of demarcating people between the good and the not as good. And those are various different ways in which this happens. One thing that's important, I think, in the charitable world is the fact that charities are often seen as different to other parts of society. Charities remain trusted. While some Charity Commission data shows certain slippage, depends which measure you use, in general, charities remain immensely trusted by the British people and around the world. In the UK, the third most trusted public institution behind doctors and the police. Why is that? Because of the lack of profit motive, because of the voluntary labour that goes into things, because of the fact that most, while our view of the charity world is dominated by large multi-million-pound charities, actually most people's experiences are about very local, very small charities close to them, run by people that they might know. And various people, Rob Macmillan has said that charities work because people illustrate them as distinct. They're able to use their distinction as a way of gaining comparative advantage. The reason that they are more trusted than other institutions is because they are different, because they are exceptional in many ways. Certain people have criticised that and say that the charities are just a part of the shadow state. I won't go into that now. But the problem with charities holding themselves up as different and distinct, and perhaps even sometimes better than the public sector or the private sector, is that there have been myriad scandals. And to a certain greater or lesser extent, the impact of some of these scandals on how charities and the charity sector is viewed. Obviously, the Olive Cook fundraising issue was blown out of proportions by the charities minister at the time in order to bring in a new regulator, which he later admitted. But you've also had the sexism at the President's Club, the collapse of Kids Company, constant Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph articles about salaries and transparency at larger charities, particularly in the international aid sector. Got critiques from the left and the NCIA about the independence of charities, and then on the other side you've got the Lobbying Act, which seek to reduce the amount that charities can lobby and campaign, and then obviously the Oxfam sex abuse scandal in Haiti and in other areas around the world, which really rocked the international development sector to its core. So you've got this argument that charities have this special position as experts and actors in the policy space, but that position is on more rocky territory than we'd assumed before. Recently the Civil Society Strategy said that society faces complex challenges and they can't be solved by government alone, but bringing together the energy and resources across society. convening partners and deploying capital to harness the expertise of charities and social enterprises and the power of the private sector. So the warm words still exist in various ways, but actually, what action do we see? We actually see charities being sidelined. Community business is an area where more money, I suppose, is going than ever before as a way of solving problems rather than maybe the traditional charity sector and voluntary sector, and critiques of civil society strategies and documents saying that really if there's no extra funding, there's not enough there. And I think we saw during the pandemic, charities had to work incredibly hard, and the infrastructure organisations, the work that they did to get the £750 million bailout probably came very late after the sector being quite ignored, and probably was far from enough in terms of the fact that charities were #never more needed. But you also have issues with this idea that charities are special and that they set themselves apart, that they have their own symbolic power in the space. So we've had the increasing gagging clauses. Various charities that are participating in the welfare state sort of are banned from criticising government policy and government issues. As one person who worked for an infrastructure charity told me, do we get an audience anymore? Not anymore. We've got a minister who hates us. And I won't say when that interview was, because actually the minister who hates us could be several ministers over recent times, I suppose. Although the fact that they forgot to appoint a civil society minister recently suggests that it's slipped even more down the list. So that's an undercutting of this positioning of charities in special. You've also got the counter problem that often there's a feeling that organisations do get slightly listened to and trusted because they're charities. But to take two examples recently from a social science perspective, there's increased, I think, concern in the social sciences about some of the research that charities do and how they try and get press attention. Two recent reports from Stonewall and from the Girl Guides have been shown to be incredibly bad uses of statistics and incredibly inaccurate press releases and ways of getting attention. And these are messages that cut through. When you see a tweet on Twitter that involves a statistic from Stonewall or the Girl Guides, I think most people are predisposed to believe that statistic because they're a charity. We assume that they must be telling the truth. Yet research in those fields shows that actually a lot of the times they're saying things that aren't statistically or sociologically accurate or not claimable. And so there's a worry that research has to be slightly better. There's an expectation of, you are a charitable organisation, you're an expert in this area, you address this issue all the time, so you must know what is good. Not always, let's be honest, said someone else at an infrastructure charity. This feeling that sometimes charities get overly lauded as knowing exactly what they're doing. Sean O'Neill, who uncovers the Oxfam scandal, summed it up like this: what I'd like to see is the aid sector, which, if you like, has been cosseted and protected, face up to the culture that is festered in there and realise that that culture has to change. I think there is a political will in the UK, but there's an extraordinary code of silence around the whole place. So a feeling in some quarters that the sector and certain parts of the sector were aware that there are problems, but because they're fearful of losing donations, fearful of losing money, fearful of losing reputation, don't do anything about these things. And so that sort of leads us on to Kids Company, which collapsed 6 years ago now, but amazingly continues to make headlines until very recently, as the recent attempt to have Camilla Batmangelish, Alan Yentob, and other trustees of Kids Company was revoked, and they did not have their license to trustee taken away. So in 2015, Kids Company collapsed. For those who don't know, Kids Company was a youth charity focused mostly in South London, but with outposts in Bristol and London. And Liverpool, and for a long time had been a favourite of governments, both of Labour and Conservative, run by Camilla Batman-Gellish, who was sort of in the youth sector quite a famous figure. She was often asked on things like Question Time to go and be the face of the sector, or in fact the face of youth issues or inner city urban issues. And they took the approach of any child that came to them with help should with a need should be helped. So this idea of never turning a child away meant that this charity lived on the edge financially a hell of a lot. At one point, Kids Company was taking up 4/5 of the Department for Education's discretional budget, and at other times it was taking up a huge amount of the amount of money that the Department for Education was investing in youth issues under both Labour and Conservative governments. She was regularly photographed and meeting with Prince Charles, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and Kids Company was held up as a way that we can access hard to reach young people and solve their issues. However, in 2015, there was a police report with accusations of sexual assault on the premises, and that led to a sort of unspooling of various different criticisms that were held about Kids Company. Funders started to pull out. The Cabinet Office refused to give the charity much more funding originally until ministers intervened and forced them to. And then the charity broke the rules attached to that funding, and the whole thing collapsed relatively quickly, with the youth centres shutting their doors. Within the symbolic arena, though, Kids Company and Camilla Batman-Gellish played on, I think it's reasonable to say, the symbolic power that was attached to both charity in general, but also the specific work that they were doing of trying to reach children who were suffering immensely in many situations, but were not getting looked after by the state. Batman-Gellish herself was an incredibly charismatic woman, a psychotherapist by training, incredibly bright, incredibly articulate, and incredibly dominant. I think it's fair to say she was very good at getting her own way. She called herself the fat beggar, and she said, "I'm excellent, basically, at weaponizing our charity's need and making sure that we get the money that we need in order to do the work that we think is so important." At one point, the charity wrote a letter to the Cabinet Office, I think, saying that there'll be riots in the streets if you take away our money, because of the young people that will no longer be helped. So they were willing to play the political game in order to get what they wanted. Sociologically, charisma is a tricky concept. Someone like Max Weber wrote many years ago that we have 3 different forms of authority in society. You have traditional authority that comes from traditions, you have legal authority that comes from the law, and you have charismatic authority, which is the idea that we have a tendency to follow people who are charismatic. We have a tendency to believe them and to trust them and go along with what they say. And Obama would be a terrific example of that. Trump would be another interesting example that certainly a lot of people found very charismatic and someone to follow. The problem comes in certain places where you have people who rely on their charisma rather than the rule book in order to run things. As Eisenstadt put it half a century ago now on charismatic leaders, what do? They disavow rational scientific calculation. They operate without elaborate systems of rules and procedures. They disdain everyday economizing. They function with a lack of provision for succession, and they contain strong tendencies towards the destruction and decomposition of institutions. If you look at the work of Kids Company and Batman-Gellish, a lot of this is very accurate when applied to her work. Incredibly impressive but did not like following the rules, really, did not have well-prescribed procedures in terms of kids' companies' finances or even its child protection approaches, really. Disdained everyday economizing, wouldn't set a budget, would just say, we'll just get as much money as we need. Functioned without a lack of succession, i.e. she was the chief executive and basically made every decision in that company. There was very little delegation. A critical attitude towards everything else, I think, can be seen in her disavowal of pretty much all of social services and child protection services that existed in local authorities in the areas where Kids Company was operating. So you've got a problem if, I think, charities rely too much on the charisma of their leaders and how they work. So you had issues around governance being the obvious ones. The board of Kids Company had been the board for a long time. Alan Yentob, who was the chair of the board, had been there in an enormous amount of time. I think hopefully everyone will be aware that good trustee boards are incredibly important, but having those honest conversations with those boards and having that information is that critical dialogue is vital to many charities, and chief executives need that sounding board. The charity, in Kids Company's case, had stopped having effective governance. The governance arrangements had become stale, and there was a lack of attention paid by the trustee board. There was a closeness to politicians that they assumed would continue forever. There was a belief that the government would never let them fold. Whereas actually, as there was a change, as critical figures, especially in Michael Gove's ear, started pointing out that all was not right behind the scenes, that started to fall away a little bit. There was a feeling that trust disappeared. If trust was incredibly important to you in generating your donations, that dries up if they don't think that you're going to deliver on your word, or that you can't meet quite straightforward government fundraising targets. Passion and professionalism. I spoke to quite a lot of people during the book about the issue of passion and professionalism in the sector, and lots of people threw it up as a sector-specific problem that they didn't quite know how to deal with. How do we cope in a sector where sometimes we excuse bad practice because someone is really, really passionate about what they do, is what one head of communications at a homelessness charity told me. Said that too many times in the sector we're willing to put up with people not doing their job quite right because they're really, really passionate about it, and we're scared of losing people. At the same time, there's the worry of and the critique of large charities, especially, that they are becoming too business-like, that business-like activities and business-like approaches are sucking the life and sucking the soul out of what charity is meant to do, that they've become too safe, I suppose. And founder syndrome. And founder syndrome is probably the most obvious problem that blew a hole in Kids Company's symbolic glow. That if someone hangs on too long, if someone it becomes incapable of telling someone that they're not doing a job well enough, or that they need to focus on other things, that's a key problem for many charities. Speaking to organisations locally, I had quotes like this from the chief executive of an alcohol support charity. I think Kids Company across the sector has harmed us. A feeling that because I don't know if you remember, it collapsed in August when there really wasn't a lot of news. There'd been a general election, it had had a relatively dull result. And then this story came along, and it was connected to power, and it was connected to a colourful character, and journalists and TV ran with it quite a lot. And that meant that charities were having to answer a hell of a lot of questions at the time from their own donors or from their own trustee boards about, do we know all of this stuff? Are we in a similar position? Do we have processes in place to deal with it? And people, chief executives going to dinner parties and said, oh, well, it's not good for you, is it, at the minute? Are charities fair game? Yes, absolutely. The public see us as just another set of big institutions, said the Director of Policy and Research at an infrastructure charity in London, saying that this sort of idea that we're untouchable, the idea that we are maybe beyond critique because we're charities, because we're full of nice people doing nice things, is something we can't rely on anymore. It's become a more critical, more questioning, more challenging age, and charities can't, especially the bigger ones, can't just sort of ride a wave of, oh, they're really nice anymore. And all of this hides the whole problem with this is that while all of this was going on, and people were talking about the problems in charity and how we should have new ideas of doing things, there was a huge crisis in children's care in the areas in which Kids Company was operating and outside of those. That local government doesn't have enough money, doesn't have enough people, and doesn't have enough resources in order to be able to deal with the immense problem that Kids Company was trying in part to deal with. Yet that sort of gets ignored as well, because that's not as sexy or as interesting a story as where's the money gone? Were you giving money to kids to buy drugs or buy trainers? Or what role did the Prime Minister or the Cabinet Office play in all of this? So that's some thoughts. There's more I could say. I'm sorry if I've spoken a bit quickly today, but there's a lot to get in, and I wanted to leave enough time for questions. But obviously, the current environment for the voluntary sector is immensely challenging, COVID notwithstanding. I think all of this sort of exists pre-COVID, and that's thrown a whole new set of challenges on. I suppose one thing that the pandemic has shown is that charity still has that power to cut through, and Captain Tom's walk around his garden being a very odd example of that, in which sort of any critique of that, both the cause that was being done for, or the way in which it became a cause célèbre and sort of the sole articulation of charity, sort of, again, we're not allowed to critique that. It became a bit like the Remembrance Poppy in many ways, as did the clap for carers on a Thursday. That became a symbolic gesture where we say we celebrate all the work that people in key services are doing, rather than actually pay them more, which I think is probably what more of them wanted. As Campbell Robb, the former head of Shelter, put it, I think that he's now at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, if we ever had a right to tell people what to do, that's certainly not true now. So an idea that the symbolic power of the charity sector has been significantly hampered over the past 10 years, partly because the funding environment has been much harsher, partly because the social environment has been much harsher. There have been more social problems over the last 10 years, austerity being the main cause of that in the UK. And that leads charities to have to do more with less, and therefore get a bit more agitated about the state of the world. But then if at the same time there are various crises in terms of sexual assault or impropriety or fundraising techniques that people find invasive, or fundraising or financial crises, then that sort of sucks away at the power of charities to be able to get a say and get a strong position in society. As Alistair Rutherford and Diamond MacDonald put it, it is no longer sufficient, if indeed it ever was, to rely on charity status to convey trust and inspire confidence in the conduct of an organisation. I suppose that's the extent to which that is true, I think, is a very interesting question. In what circumstances are things not trusted, and in what situations are they? The classic example being people are more likely to trust local organisations rather than national ones. And as someone who worked at a youth volunteering charity put it to me, I don't think it's okay for the charity sector to assume that just because we work in charity, we're all really lovely, nice people doing nice things, we should be special. charity is special and it is different, and it is a vital facet of what makes the world tick and makes everything work, and brings us together and makes society function. But we can't assume that everything within it is hunky-dory and done by nice people. The Oxfam crisis especially brought that up, all the recent stories about sexual harassment in fundraising being other examples, or the fact that Comic Relief has had to shift away from its standard fundraising package because of critiques about white saviorism and other things. And I think that's something that academic insights can bring. Academics are very good at pointing out problems or where things aren't perfect, and we are rubbish at giving solutions, I'm afraid. So I think we have to be honest about that. Symbolic power of charities, charitable acts is always going to be present. It's always going to be there. I think we're always going to look up to the people who are charitable above those people who are uncharitable. But the impact of it, the sort of impact that it has, is contextual and inconsistent. One person's "I gave £10 to this charity today" post on Facebook, one might read that as "great, well done for you, that's really good, thanks for giving." Someone else might read that as "why are you showing off?" And you can't really do anything about that, but that's something that people are wrestling with in the social media environment. But maybe it has become less manipulatable due to the critique and challenge. The Gates Foundation, for example, can't do anything really without an enormous amount of people critiquing why they're doing it, and they're only doing it because of Bill's divorce or because of negative press coverage. So there is more challenge of that. But I think for small and medium-sized organizations, that creates huge problems if you see that lack of trust filtering down to your work on the ground. But we might be losing something. You know, we don't want to live in an overly cynical world. There's too many things to be cynical about. If we're also adding the charitables, people's volunteering, people's giving to that list, that might make the world a bit of a more miserable place to be in. So I'm going to leave it there. If you want to read the book, it is out now, available from good and bad bookshops probably, and those are some references. If anybody would like these slides, I'm more than happy to send them over to Suzanne, who can share them. Thank you very much.